Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are in the world, we appreciate you being with us right now. This is Lovey Life, a Dome podcast. Dome is a digital and bilingual media company specialized in law at the supranational level. So, for all news, comments, analyses related to law in Africa and in the rest of the world, go to our website, dome-online.com, and follow us on our social media platforms, the links of which are listed below. This, however, is neither a technical nor a political podcast. To be honest, sometimes it's barely a legal one. The only prerequisite needed is to have an open mind and 30 minutes or so to spare. We sometimes will have guests from everywhere around the world, and we will always be keen to hear your thoughts. We have a fantastic episode for you today, so please stay with us and weigh in while we argue the case. Lovey Life. Can you believe we are already entering the last trimester of the year? I did not realize that time flew so much until I saw books and backpacks in shelves. A sure sign, if there is any, that kids will be back to school soon. And that, thank God, sports season is almost upon us. Of course, I know that there are some events throughout the year, and I cannot thank enough the swimmers, cyclists, golfers, boxers that have kept me sane for the last 4 months. Still, very soon, all the leagues are going to start their new seasons. At the outset, the plot lines are quite intriguing. Are the Warriors going to retain their title, or will the Suns finally break through? What the hell is happening with Ben Simmons' back? Is he okay? Is he still playing basketball? What will the unretirement of Tom Brady look like, and can he truly lead the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back to a Super Bowl? Is the Casablanca, also known as Real Madrid, going to win once again both the Liga and the Champions League, or will Barcelona roll back to prominence? Who is going to be number one in tennis at the end of the season? Truly fascinating stuff. I cannot wait to see it unfold. A lot of answers depend, of course, on the usual factors, mainly health, schedule, and rosters for collective sports. But since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, the phrase availability is the best commodity certainly took another connotation. The fate of seasons and/or tournaments have hung on the participation of certain athletes. For example, the Nets 2021-2022 showing was truly bizarre. No definite lineup, no rhythm, and a final record that genuinely baffles anyone that knows anything about the sport. If we were to dissect the reasons why the season was such a letdown, an important part of it, though not all, let's be fair, had to do with the decision of Kyrie Irving not to take the COVID-19 vaccine. And since the state of New York required that people going in public places be vaccinated, Kyrie Irving was not allowed to train with the team and play in Brooklyn. In the second half of the season, he was back in the fold, at least partially, traveling with the team for away games, sometimes putting up masterful performances, might I add, but could not play in his home court of Barclays Center, depriving us of truly seeing in action perhaps the best trio of pure shooters ever assembled. And that is a mouthful in basketball. To be exhaustive, it must be said that Kyrie Irving cited personal and religious beliefs as reasons in his decision not to comply with the mandate. Another example we can take is that of Novak Djokovic, former number one in tennis, that was locked in a legal battle at the beginning of the year with the Australian government. Australia had put in place extremely stringent measures for travelers wishing to enter the country, one of which being obviously to be vaccinated. Novak Djokovic applied for an exemption for the duration of his stay, assured that he would only travel between the court and his personal quarters, and would submit at any given point to testing. The exemption was first granted, then suspended, and finally revoked, forcing Djokovic to withdraw from the Australian Open in January. He is also to miss the US Open that has started on August 29, 2022, due to the vaccine mandate. He too cited personal reasons while explaining his decision not to get the vaccine. I have taken the examples of these two incredible athletes because 1. I love sports, almost as much as I love law, but also because their situations were heavily scrutinized and criticized. A very quick research online will let you know exactly how their stance was received in the media and by the public at large. The consensus was that their attitude was irresponsible. Because Kyrie Irving is a basketball player of the highest caliber, and therefore an important part of the team's success, he was called selfish, unreliable, and mercurial. Djokovic, as a tennis player, was called temperamental, entitled, and self-absorbed. To be fair, both these athletes have always been outspoken on a variety of topics and have a long storied history of friction with the press. Now, without going as far as calling people names when in fact we know nothing about them, I, and most sports-loving people, have at times been frustrated by their decisions because we love competition and we love performances. Therefore, we would love to see Kyrie on the court on a regular basis, especially with Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons. Rucker Park won't do. Just like we feel slighted with Djokovic, because his decision is now depriving us of seeing the impossible quest for the first tennis player to win 30 major tournaments in his or her career. And he would have had a real shot if he was not skipping half the season due to his decisions. Basically, we in the general public, and certainly we, sports fans, are acting like brats because we see them as athletes first, there to entertain and thrill us with physical prowess that we envy, and only then, after all of that, we think of them as people who deserve to have their own ethos, thought process, and belief system respected. It does not help that both these athletes have divisive personalities and a lot of money. Because let's face it, the decision of both Kyrie Irving and Novak Djokovic not to get the vaccine will not affect, in the grand scheme of things, neither their status nor their ability to provide for their families. You see, they are already at the top of their games. Quite literally in the case of Djokovic. They can afford not to go to work. Yes, a competitor loves to compete, but missing half of their respective seasons is not going to make a financial impact on their lives, for either of them. I am sure they are gutted to not be able to live their passions, but then again, all things considered, they are privileged to be in a situation where they can put their foot down. Do you know who can't afford to do so? People working in the health sector. Doctors, nurses, their vendors, etc., etc. The people who have put their lives on the line for us, for little to no money at all, when we did not have vaccines or any idea what we were dealing with for that matter, who took an oath to protect the sanctity of life and human body. They don't get to choose. It's either take the shot, regardless of your personal beliefs, or go home without the ability to feed your family in a context of inflation, because few doctors and even fewer nurses can actually afford to quit their jobs. And given that the legislation is applicable in the entire sector nationwide, they are not likely to find another post in the industry easily. If we take both these situations in turn, and if we are being honest with ourselves, we are likely to roll our eyes at the players and feel for the nurses and doctors. This is a great example of the reason why Lady Justice is always depicted blind, as I said in a previous episode. It only cares about the legal qualifications applicable to a set of facts and the potential consequences these legal qualifications may carry. Law does not deal with feelings and emotions, because quite simply, it cannot afford to do so. Everyone has different sensibilities and nuances we would like to be taken into consideration, but it is simply not possible. When you take the bare facts, you realize that the two situations are exactly the same in the eye of the law. During the first and second wave of the pandemic, roughly in the end of 2020 and throughout 2021, governments around the world adopted stringent measures and decided that certain situations would be more conducive to spreading the virus and needed to be avoided as much as possible. In that regard, the fact that the person is in fact perceived as a capricious and wealthy athlete on the one hand, or a very hardworking and selfless nurse on the other, was irrelevant. As this series is titled Lovey Life, I have not forgotten, I promise, we are going to take what we just said and apply a legal filter to it, because I think there are some very interesting legal concepts to be talked about. There is a flurry of angles we could choose to look into, religious freedom being one, the right to privacy being another, the right to dispose of one's body is also very interesting, all of which have been treated to some degree. And if you want me to look into this, please do let me know. I would be happy to do so in another podcast, using another case study, or the same one. You choose. In today's program, we are going to focus on the angle that I find particularly interesting. The right to work. It is again one of those things that seems so obvious that people take it for granted, not realizing that law has touched on the subject. So then, let's explore the concept a bit more. The right to work is a human right that is enshrined in many international legal instruments. To cite a few, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23.1, quote, "Everyone has the right to work, the free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment." End of quote. Another instrument is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Part 3, Article 6. Quote, "The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right to work, which includes the right to the opportunity to gain his living by work, which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right." End of quote. A final reference can be found in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 15. Quote, "Every individual shall have the right to work under equitable and satisfactory conditions, and shall receive equal pay for equal work." End of quote. First things first, it must be said that international law works a little bit differently than any other branch of the law, for no other reasons that as opposed to civil law, criminal law, or even constitutional law that deal with the relationship between individuals and the relationships between individuals and states, the main subjects of international law are states who have sovereignty, then international organizations, and, to a lesser extent, individuals. Because they have sovereignty, states get to choose which instrument they become party to. Once they have signed, however, they are bound and must abide by them. That is very rough, obviously. I don't get into international customary law, jus cogens, etc., etc. Very, very interesting stuff, but I kind of have a feeling you're not that interested in it. So, in our case, all of the countries that have signed the treaties I've mentioned earlier, quite basically every country in the world, have the obligation to guarantee and protect the right to work. Now, to be fair, States do not need any pressure to fulfill their international obligation to offer the right to work in their territory, as this obligation aligns with states' interests. And of course, it exists. That's called a marketplace. All of our governments, yours and mine, dream of a full employment situation. Is it to say that the reality is perfect? Of course not. Every country is dealing with discrimination, protectionism, anti-competition laws, all of that. And we can talk about it if you're interested, by the way. Do let me know. But, in general terms, states are more than happy to have athletes, nurses, doctors, and whoever else exercise their right to work, make a living out of it, and pay their taxes. Now, as no one knew the origins, the symptoms, or the treatment of the disease, governments around the world decided to take the more radical approach by first putting all of us in lockdown for an extended period of time while the scientific community was hard at work. And then, when a formula for a vaccine was approved by the regulators, they made it mandatory for all of us to get it. In legal terms, our government unilaterally curtailed our individual rights and freedoms. And this is what people like Kyrie Irving and Novak Djokovic take exception to. One of the reasons they do not feel like this vaccine should be mandatory is that they don't feel comfortable with the speed with which the vaccine was made available, that the long-term effects on the body are still largely unknown, and that its reliability is not guaranteed, as vaccinated people can not only get but also spread the disease. To what extent these critics are medically valid, I will be the first one to tell you that I have absolutely no idea. As you may have noticed, in this podcast, we don't opine on matters so much as we seek to understand the legal process behind them and the reaction of society to them. This is why, by the way, all the titles of our episodes end in question marks. I am not qualified to speak on these issues as I do not have a medical training. My training is in law. And legally speaking, a state of emergency grants prerogatives to governments to not only take measures that would encroach on our constitutionally protected rights and freedoms, but also to do so while bypassing the normal legal process to enact a law or take a decree. It is not the first and will not be the last time that this happens. During wars, people have been forcibly enlisted, companies have been nationalized, properties have been seized, etc., etc. You know the saying, all is fair in love and war. The idea here is that the collective good is above any personal inconvenience, and governments impose sanctions on those who do not comply, regardless of how valid their concern may seem to them. If you would like to read more on these questions, there is a case that has been filed and is pending before the International Court of Justice between Germany and Italy that could be of interest, and is of course available on DOM's website. The legal question of the case deals with the matter of jurisdictional immunities of the state, which is a quintessential question in international law, and not exactly what we've been discussing. But the facts of the case are worth reading, in my opinion. To go back on course and summarize the situation from a state's perspective, trying to safeguard the public interest is the main reason a government exists in the first place. So, when something happens to threaten said public interest, governments have reasons enough to limit the right of each citizen, resident, or person wishing to enter the country, including the very fundamental right to work. If said citizen, resident, or person wishing to enter the country does not comply with the adopted policy. Conceptually, we get the process, and that is a sacrifice that most people would be willing to make for the greater good. That's all good and well. However, the question must be asked. Where do we draw the line? You see, we have just said that as a necessary prerequisite for curtailing people's freedom, and doing so by failing to follow constitutionally established procedure, a crisis must occur. The country must be facing a state of emergency. But a state of emergency essentially requires both a risk of immediate and irreparable damage to the society as a whole and the urgency to act to try and prevent it. The minute one of these criteria is not met, there is no state of emergency to speak of, and therefore the exceptional measures must be lifted so as to go back to quote-unquote normal in a legal sense, meaning people enjoying their rights and freedoms in full, including, of course, the right to work and earn a living. To extend exceptional measures when it is no longer necessary is legally extremely dangerous. The tricky part, of course, is that the states are the ones that can restrict our rights and freedoms, while also being ultimately the ones that decide when the state of emergency is no longer needed and therefore applicable. That is a lot of power, and as First Baron Lord Acton so brilliantly put, quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." End of quote. Without getting conspiratorial, a healthy dose of scrutiny is always needed when governments anywhere around the world are starting to limit people's rights and freedoms, for whatever reason. We need safeguards in times of crisis, always, to make sure that we find our way back to normal. And perhaps in this case, unknowingly and probably unwillingly so, people like Kyrie Irving and Novak Djokovic play that role. Now, I want to be clear. They have never pretended to try and represent anybody else other than themselves. However, both are extremely talented, accomplished, famous, and may be labeled difficult. It's hard to relate, let alone sympathize and empathize with them. So we tend to roll our eyes when they complain about not being able to exercise their right of work at the 2022 US Open for Djokovic, and some questions still remain for the new NBA seasons for Irving. That being said, for all those reasons, because they are talented, accomplished, famous, wealthy, and yes, labeled difficult, people want to know what they are up to. So, they may serve a bigger purpose than what we give them credit for. Because legally speaking, they are in the same boat as those nurses and doctors around the world that are not allowed to have a job without getting vaccinated due to the vaccine mandate, and for whom we instinctively care. Unfortunately, because life is so taxing, the news cycle is so fast. Sometimes it seems that one problem just erased the previous one, and we don't always follow a story to its conclusion. But every time Djokovic tries to enter a country that requires a vaccine and makes a whole stink about it, while winning a fair amount of the tournaments he can participate in, and every time Kyrie puts up out-of-the-world numbers on away games, we may subconsciously, and perhaps even very clearly and loudly, ask ourselves if the vaccine mandate is still a necessary measure, and if it is not time for the right to work to be restored in full and for everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to hear what you have to say. Do you have any comments, questions? Does it make sense? Does it not? Leave a comment below the link on the episode on our social media platforms using the hashtag #LovieLife. The transcript of the program will be available on Dome's website in both French and English. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing, liking it, and subscribing to the show. We have had some great episodes previously, and we would be very grateful if you would consider listening to them. We will be back with our next episode next Wednesday. In the meantime, please stay safe and take care of yourself.